we're making a little bit of a jump maybe from the last discussion about the university as a sort of system and the individual to, if you will, the in-between level, namely the research climate. And today I want to talk you through a couple of results that hopefully will pave some first steps towards a more responsible research climate. And the structure of my talk will be as follows. I'll give a little bit of background in the forms of, how do I define a research climate and how do we situate our work in a sort of broader literature. Then I'll dwell on, our focus group methodology, how we recruited particular participants, what procedures we adhere to, and what type of analysis we did. And I'll then go through 3 different types of findings, namely the characteristics for a responsible research climate, the barriers to this responsible research climate to get there, and then the interventions to help overcome these barriers. And I'll close with a little bit of situating our work into the research climate in a sort of broader research integrity debate. Now, I talk about climate, but there's actually a fair chance that you've heard about research culture before. And here I've just pulled up 3 codes, the Danish Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, the Netherlands Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, and the ELIA that all say something about research culture, whether it's fostering a culture of research integrity, that it's important to provide an open and safe, inclusive research culture. So there is, and I feel like all of this is part of what really can be seen as the background of my project, that initially when we talked about research misbehavior and why research would misbehave, we tended to put the focus on the individual level, on the bad apple that you can still somewhat see over here. And increasingly over time, it's become apparent that the organization and the research climate also plays a substantial role in either fostering or undermining integrity in research. Now, we defined the research climate as follows, and here I'm following rather famous work by organizational climate scientist Schneider, who says that the research climate stands for the shared meaning that organizational members attach to the events, policies, practice, and procedures they experience, and the behaviors that they see rewarded, supported, and expected. So, in a nutshell, if you were to focus on the research culture, you would dig into the values and the norms that ultimately drive the sort of behaviors. But if you focus on the research climate, your focus shifts towards a little bit more tangible, the behaviors, the policies, and the practices. So that's what I want to talk you through today. But of course, this interest in researchers' behavior and in researchers' practices, that's not really new, and it can, at least I believe, be traced back to researchers like famous sociologist Robert Merton and his work on scientific norms. And later, Zuckerman built upon this work and connected the failure to uphold these scientific norms to various forms of scientific fraud. But Merton's norms have not been uncriticized, and at least part of that critique came from researchers arguing that if you want to understand research behavior, you have to study science from within. And here, most notably, many of you will think of Latour, who, with his fellows, really immersed himself inside the laboratory to study this research climate firsthand as a phenomenon that he defined as something that was governed by local knowledge and local rules. Now, there has already been some, and it's mostly quantitative work, into the relationship between the research climate and research integrity. So, for example, the studies here by Anderson and by de Vries have shown us that in a climate where suspicion is high and there's a lot of competition among peers, that researchers were more likely to report research misbehavior. And on the other hand, work by Anderson et al. And Crane has shown that conversely, if you really socialize researchers into responsible research practices, then we were much less likely to report irresponsible or detrimental research practices. Now, we wanted to learn a little bit more about how researchers, academic researchers in Amsterdam would understand this research climate? You know, if they would wake up and the world would have magically changed, what characteristics would give away that we now lived in a very responsible research climate? So we asked them to write down characteristics in our focus groups and to discuss these with their neighbours. We talked about them in the group. And then when we had the sort of key characteristics on the table, we said, okay, but what sort of barriers are you currently experiencing that are in the way of these characteristics coming to their fullest expression? And even one step further, what sort of interventions can you think of collectively to alleviate these barriers where possible? Now, as I already said, we used focus groups, and there are various academic institutions in Amsterdam, and we wanted to make sure that we heard all the different researchers from the different disciplines, and specifically the biomedical sciences, the natural sciences, social and behavioral sciences, and the humanities. And our recruitment approach for this was threefold. We approached all the heads of departments of all the different institutes in Amsterdam, asking them if they knew of interested researchers that would like to talk to us. We also used their own collegial network. And lastly, we invited researchers at random in the hope to get even some other voices that may perhaps not have thought much about this topic before. And our focus groups were always led by a moderator that was accompanied by an observer. And it was really the observer's task to make notes about the process and its content. And we used inductive content analysis to analyze our results. And it's important to say here that inductive content analysis was sort of focused by the definition of climate that I put up earlier. So we were really interested in, you know, behaviors, practices, and policies that researchers had been talking about. Now, here you can see that we've conducted 12 focus groups in total with 61 researchers from different academic ranks and different disciplinary fields. And the academic rank part is important because we wanted to make sure that people felt safe to speak freely. And that's why we conducted these focus groups only with people from similar ranks. Now, I first want to walk you through the 5 characteristics of a responsible research climate, according to our researchers. And it starts with fair evaluation. And that was thought to be conducive to a responsible research climate because it would encourage researchers to engage in responsible research. And in particular, this meant that to do that and to encourage people to do that, institutes should have sound policies for talent development, for selection, and for internal promotion, and that were really tailored to people's academic rank and their disciplinary fields and to their own strengths as well. And that's nicely illustrated by this particular quote. And this is from an assistant professor in the social sciences who really talks about her discontent with having to excel on all the different topics, that the list of the things that she has to do to get promoted just keeps getting longer and longer, and it's annoying her. And that there simply seems to be no priority. You'd have to excel on everything, and that feels really unfair to her. Now, the second important characteristic is openness, and this can really be understood also by our participants as an umbrella concept. So it involved the open research practices like open data, open code, but also open collaboration, international collaboration. But importantly here, it also involved open communication between colleagues. And here, one biomedical researcher put that rather well, where he said that we have a sort of atmosphere where we feel that people are open to discuss these sort of things with others. And if you think someone is doing something rather oddly, that you can discuss that, and you don't have to be afraid that people feel inherently attacked, and that there is a sort of common understanding, you know, we're just trying to all do our best. We can work this out together, and we can continue to do better. A third important characteristic is sufficient time. This may seem like a no-brainer, but researchers were really annoyed by their research time often being overshadowed by other tasks or administrative duties, teaching, clinical duties. And it was their understanding that if you want to do responsible research, if you want to have a responsible climate, some of that work really takes time. And I cannot say it more eloquently than this professor from the humanities who said, you know, it means having the time to think and write, because so often teaching sort of eats up all our research time. So give us the autonomy and the power to also protect that much value research time. Then, of course, integrity pervaded a lot of our discussions. And to our participants, integrity meant that departmental leaders, for example, would not only encourage their personnel to develop their scientific competencies, but also their moral competencies. And in terms of behavior, integrity really meant, according to our participants, that researchers engage very critically with their own work. Or in the words of this professor from the natural sciences, that you are the first to doubt your own research results. Now, trust is of course also pivotal to have and to create together a responsible research climate. And it's important to note here that our participants did not understand trust to be, sitting back and just relying on your peers to do whatever they do, but trust had to be actively sustained. People had to hold each other accountable for trust to come to its best expression. And here also participants noted that, you really have to trust those beneath and above you to conduct good research, and that they're claiming what they're claiming for a very good reason. And finally, freedom was very important to have a responsible research climate. And here, freedom was also understood as the freedom to choose what to investigate and to the freedom to disagree with the existing scientific paradigm and the freedom to engage in scholarly debate. So it's, again, the choice of topic. And the reason for that was important because, and this is something that was echoed by many other participants, it's you that often knows, because you're in a field so close, what's going to have the potential for success or change. Now, I'll walk you through 4 different barriers. And the first one is the lack of support, and that can really be understood to be a very broad barrier. So here people talked about an intense administrative burden that they perceived and ineffective administrative systems. And some professors connected this to the fact that the universities had centralized all of the different support systems. So all these support agents were super generalists and nobody was really able to help them. But PhD students also said that sometimes they even lacked the support to develop academically. And this is a quote from one PhD student from the natural sciences who talks about the sort of technical support from this very brilliant technician that knew everything about all the different lasers that they were using in their lab. And the person had been there for 15 years, and all PhD students would be trained by him, and then they were able to do their own work. But of course, at some point, less grant money came in, and this person went to a different university. Now, another important point was the perceived unfair evaluation. This resonates a little bit to the previous talk as well, maybe, but it was that people felt that they were evaluated purely on the quantity of their publications and not so much on the quality of their scientific work. So this is a professor from, full professor from the social sciences who talks about that, this tendency that we have and the urge that we have to score everyone using the sort of same golden metric, and how this can be so difficult, and how universities should have more freedom to have their own sort of policies in what we understand to be good quality work. Then, a little bit maybe closer to home to many of you, at least for me, is the sort of normalization of overwork. And this was that participants felt that they were sort of expected to do the majority of their research in their own time, and that it seemed perfectly normal to work weeks of 60 hours, and that they also felt stressed because they had to be available for their colleagues in the weekends or in the evenings. And this sort of quote really moved me in that regard, and it is from a postdoctoral researcher who expressed to her supervisor that she was having pain in her arms and in her neck from all the working. And the supervisor's reply, "I've had that for 20 years, so what?" Then there is the insufficient supervision, and this was actually understood by senior researchers as the lack of responsible role models. But both senior researchers and junior or early career researchers contended that it was very difficult to get a good understanding of what's expected of a responsible supervisor. How do you become a responsible supervisor? And one of them compared it to teaching. That, now you have a course on teaching, but, in the past, nobody learned how to teach. And bear in mind, some people are absolute naturals, but many of us may not be. And it's the sort of idea that you'll just get this, you'll just do this. And that may be the same with supervision at this point. Now, there are quite a lot of interventions that were discussed. So the terms on this screen here are really just broadly, but the improvement of support could of course be done in many ways by lowering the administrative burden of people, and also by the sort of better talent development policies and for internal promotion that we talked about earlier. And here, most notably, people said, it should not just be the mere sort of amount of funding that someone has been able to recruit, but it should also be that those leaders in the department and professors should get some more autonomy again in deciding whom they want to promote and why, and whom they want to give what task to. And this is also illustrated by this professor, that he feels very annoyed that, there's presumably a lot of respect for me, but not when it comes to hiring decisions, whereas I know these people and I see their potential and I would like to be more involved in the sort of promotion decisions. Then there was many people acknowledged it's healthy to do something else than work, and we should more openly discuss our expectations about availability and unavailability. And this really had to involve PhD students as well. And notably, supervisors had to be aware about the perhaps unintended expectations that they would convey if they sent their PhD students most of their messages in the evening or over the weekends. And here one professor is actually talking about some fairly good examples of colleagues that she knows that are very mindful of that. So if they work on the weekend, they make sure not to send it to their PhD students because they don't want to get that message across. And then in terms of practically improving supervision, some biomedical researchers actually coined the idea of creating a sort of discipline-specific manual. And a lot of people, regardless of their disciplinary field, said it should be at least better sort of formalized and formulated what it is that we expect a good supervisor to do. What is a responsible role model? And this is actually a nice conversation between a couple of biomedical PhD students who talks about that, there are these courses, nobody goes, we should just make them compulsory. If you didn't do this course on good supervision, you're just not allowed to supervise. Now, let me close with connecting this a little bit, all of what we just discussed, to research integrity. And you may say, those barriers of yours, like, really, are they so typical for the research climate for integrity? I mean, think about normalization of overwork. I mean, many of us in this pandemic era have talked about an epidemic of burnout and how it becomes very normal to work all the time. And I think it's important to understand that to our participants, this entailed the sort of risk for integrity of them not being as critical or as sharp in the idea that if you're continuously overworked or maybe even burned out, you're just less likely to spot flaws, or you're just maybe more tempted to give in to temptations. But it's not a necessary consequence, but this is how they understood this relationship. And then secondly, I mean, in terms of a lack of support, actually, some of our participants even understood this as a form of research waste. I mean, we put valuable grant money to a professor's salary in the idea that that person governs the workings of a research group, not in the idea that that professor, who has a very high salary, spends most of his days assuring lab supplies because he has no support. And that's not what we want. That's a form of waste. And thirdly, when it comes to insufficient supervision, you may say, don't we all sometimes complain about our boss? And yes, we do. And our participants just saw a very great role in making supervision more responsible. And it's not that PhD students without responsible role models need go astray, but if they have very irresponsible role models, there is a chance they internalize those more flawed research practices. And of course, the characteristics that I've talked about of a responsible research climate are also not all new. If we think about collaboration, and the openness in communication, that's also work from Johnson and Lysa in the UK that found this to be conducive to responsible research. Manafo et al. Famously summed up a really large array of open research practices. And of course, these are scholars from the organizational research climate, and for years they've emphasized how important it is that we have fair promotion criteria and fair evaluation criteria. And lastly, I mean, the idea that institutions should be more specific about what it is that they expect of supervisors has also been an idea that's been humming around for quite some time already. And one possible way of doing this is proposed by Mo et al., who wrote up the Hong Kong Principles for Assessing Research, and that would be to incorporate it into the formal evaluation criteria, like really valuing supervision as a scientific activity in its own right. Now, it may be hard to change the research climate. And, you know, like the meteorological climate, and that's an analogy that I haven't thought of myself, this is from Artisan et al., you know, the research climate is influenced by different factors, individual researchers, the system governing science. But it is, if we stick to this analogy, it is the sort of realization that there's something wrong that can spark the sort of behavioral change we may be looking for. I want to say I did not do this work alone. I benefited from very helpful co-authors and co-researchers, you know, Juri Tijdink, Lex Bouter, Roelien Pasman, who's a phenomenal qualitative researcher, and the same regard for Guy Widdershoven. And if you would like to learn more, you can either read the paper that I've put up on the screen here, but you're also very welcome to attend my online defense on January 14th, where I'll be defending this research and much more. Thank you very much.